Diversity of Life Investigation 3.2C, Protist Cell Structures. Hi everyone, again it's Mr. Kennard. In our last lesson we were talking about paramecium and how they were different and how they were similar to the Elodea plant cells. We ended the last lesson looking at how they were different, what we saw in some of the illustrations, the videos, the pictures, the images, etc., of how they were different and how they were similar. We had said that, Elodias, how they're different is obviously that, Elodea stays in one place. They're brick-like structures. They're locked in that brick-like structure. They're all stuck together. Their cells are much smaller than maybe the protist or the paramecium, and that they are actually part of a bigger organism. There's many, many cells that go with it, where the protist, the paramecium, I should say, they're moving around, they're alone, they're independent, they're not part of a bigger organism, they are of themselves, and yeah, they are much larger than that. Paramecium fit into a much bigger category of living things called protist. But so far what we've seen is, if we're talking about living things, then we're talking about them being made of cells. And they can be one cell, like the paramecium, living independently, or they can be made up of many cells. But in order to have life, they have to be made of cells. That is the most important part of all of this. So we're going to look, we also, when we were looking at the paramecium, some of you noticed some structures that were inside of it. We pointed out some of those structures. They were different colors in the structures that were inside of the Elodea plant. Well, we're going to then focus a little bit more on some of those structures of the paramecium and see which ones they have in common or maybe are different than the plant cell. For much of this lesson, we'll be making use of fosweb.com, so you'll need to go to it, the website. You're going to click on Diversity of Life, obviously. Look through the multimedia, and you're going to find the levels of complexity. And it will take you to this particular sheet. You're going to find cells, and we're going to focus on protists. Paramecium fit into that category of protists. Protists are single-celled organisms. They come from the word proto, the Greek word proto, which means early, and single-celled organisms like paramecium are similar to some of the earliest known life forms on Earth. Now, keep in mind, a protist is not an animal. Animals they move around like animals, we think, like fish or something like that, but no, they are not animals. Animals are always multicellular organisms. Many protists, like paramecium, are single-celled. As you read through this one up here, protists are paramecia, like amoeba and the parasite that causes malaria. There are single-celled organisms. But others, like volvox, live in colonies, and still others are part of multicellular organisms like algae. All protists live in some kind of water-based environment. Some protists contain chlorophyll and help them make their own food, and others must eat other organisms, like we saw in that previous video where the amoeba was eating the paramecium to stay alive. So we'll be using this one, and specifically we'll be looking at the next one below it to give us these cell structures, to look at some of the same things that we saw from our Elodea plants and see how they compare with the ones from the protists. Now, just like Elodea cells, paramecia have parts called organelles and cell structures also. Some of the structures are the same and some are different. The paramecium still has filled with cytoplasm like the Elodea cells, and all the other structures float in that substance. The other boundary of the paramecium is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is flexible and protects the paramecium from the surrounding environment. It also allows the paramecium to regulate its internal environment, can let things in and out. The Elodea cells also have cell membranes too, but we couldn't see them because of the cell wall. So it's like an inner lining inside of that cell wall. The paramecium moves using little hairs called cilia around the outside. And those are an adaptive feature of the paramecium to be able to move in water. You may have also been able to see the nucleus, which in effect is the control center of the cell. All plant cells and paramecium have a nuclei. You'll be able to see a contractile vacuole, which pumps excess water out of the cell as well. So there's lots of structures, lots of organelles that the paramecium have that the Elodia or Elodia cell also have. You need to download and complete then this Protist Cell structures and functions worksheet. And go back to FOSS-Web, find the levels of complexity, and then find cell structures, and that will help you answer some of these. The other one on the Elodia cell had the cell structures listed, but you had to find the function. In this case, they give you the functions, and you have to find which of these in this box up here match up in the cell structure with them. So once you do, write the words to it, the boundary, the membrane, the internal fluid, I think we know is cytoplasm. We could fill that in. So go through FOSS-Web, find that levels of complexity. Cell structures is the one you want to find in that left-hand column, and you'll be using that to complete this and upload it later in the lesson. Reminder again of how you get there. Access FOSSWeb.com, choose the Diversity of Life unit, go to the Multimedia section and select Levels of Complexity, and then find in the left-hand column the cell structures. And then be asking yourself as you go through it, what structures are common and which ones are unique to each organism. The Elodia plant will have different organisms and structures in its cells than the paramecium will have in its. So keep those in mind as you're going through them, maybe even compare the cell structures with the previous sheet that you did as well. We can now add paramecium to your evidence of life chart. And then based on what you observe, what evidence do you have that paramecium are living organisms? If we go through that stuff, we saw about reproduction. We saw about taking in water. We saw about eliminating wastes. We saw about some of the other one, food, taking in food. So all of those responding to their environment when they bump into something, when they leave something, when they flee because of too much light, etc. All of those would be additional things that we can include to provide evidence that paramecium are living organisms. So again, our focus questions are: how are Elodia and paramecium alike, and how are they different? One tool that we could use is a T-chart. The box up here is how are they alike, and then IKE, terrible with this. How are they alike, and then the T-chart shows us how they are different. We could have the paramecium on one side and the Elodia on the other, about how they're different. How they're together, they obviously have cells, they like water, or they need water and have water. They show you need to, they're very small, you need a microscope. Writing terrible with this stylus, but it's fun anyway. And they do show characteristics, show life-like. But then we went through and looked at some of the reasons and how they're different. Obviously, paramecium can move freely, whereas Elodia are part stuck together. They move about. One is a protist. Let's see here. One is a plant, so that's different. One is a one cell, where these are multi-celled. You could have, these are bigger, and these are smaller. Funny. The Elodia had chloroplasts, little green balls, etc., right? Chloroplasts, no green chloroplasts or chlorophylls. These guys were the brick shapes, the boxes. These guys were more of an oval shape. So you can see how they do have things in common and then how they are different. And that's how you would use this to answer your focus question. One way is through a common box and T-chart that can be used to show the differences. To wrap this lesson up, we're going to be looking at the vocabulary terms for this lesson. Obviously, asexual reproduction is how single-celled organisms reproduce. They get two new from the one parent, two from one. We'll talk about sexual reproduction later. That's the flip. You get one new from two. So, multicellular organisms are things like animals, many cells, cells that are living that make up the entire organism that is living. Paramecium is a single-celled organism. We talk about single-celled down here at the bottom. That's just one cell only, and it is a living thing. One group of some of those single cells are protists, and one example of a protist is paramecium. So that kind of gives you some of the vocabulary terms for this one as well. You may want to include those. What you'll be doing next is taking all this information on the Elodea as being a multi-celled organism and the paramecium as a single-celled organism, and you'll be adding your responses to a discussion. Read carefully what the discussion asks you to do, and then put your comments in the discussion reply section. And that will be a way to see how well you're progressing in understanding the differences and similarities between two different groups of living things.